Daniel had always been an ordinary man. He lived a simple life in a modest apartment in the city center, with a monotonous routine of work and solitude. It all started on an ordinary morning when Daniel woke up still sleepy and headed to the bathroom. The mirror was the first thing to greet him every day, reflecting his tired and aged figure even before his first coffee. But that morning, something seemed. While washing his face, Daniel lifted his head and looked into the mirror. His reflection was staring back at him, as always. But then, for a brief second, he swore he saw his reflection blink before him. He stopped, feeling the blood run cold in his veins. He blinked rapidly several times, trying to synchronize his movements with the reflection. However, he saw nothing else out of the ordinary. He laughed, thinking his mind had played a trick on him. After all, it was early, and he had barely slept the night before. Daniel continued his morning routine. That uncomfortable feeling persisted. The image in the mirror seemed to watch him with an unnatural intensity. If it were studying his every move. He left the bathroom with a shiver he couldn't explain, unaware that this would be just the first of many strange encounters with his own reflection. The following days were marked by a growing sense of discomfort. Daniel avoided looking at the mirror for long periods of time, but it was inevitable in his routine. Whenever he approached it, he felt an almost palpable presence on the other side of the glass, as if he were not alone. He began to notice strange little details. His reflection seemed to smile a little more than he did, a subtle, mischievous curve of the lips that did not match his real expression. On one particularly tense night, Daniel found himself staring at the mirror for longer than usual. He was tired, exhausted from work, and his eyes were red from sleep. But what he saw in the reflection was something completely different. His reflection was wide awake, eyes fixed, and a disturbing smile that should not have been there. Daniel stepped back, his heart racing. "This is impossible," he muttered to himself. "I'm just imagining things." But when he turned to leave, he saw, out of the corner of his eye, his reflection still standing there, still smiling, even after he had moved. The image remained static for a second longer than it should have. A second long enough to send fear into Daniel's heart. He ran into his room, closing the door behind him, and feeling like a terrified child who had just seen a monster. But this was different. The monster was him, or rather, something that looked exactly like him. Daniel tried to sleep, but sleep did not come easily, haunted by the idea that something on the other side of the mirror wanted more than just to reflect his image. The next day, Daniel decided to avoid mirrors as much as possible. He shaved without looking at himself, spent the day at work restlessly, and avoided any reflective surfaces. But as night fell, he couldn't escape his growing fear. He needed to confront what was happening, needed to prove to himself that it was just his imagination. Taking a deep breath, he stood in front of the bathroom mirror once more. His reflection stared back at him, nothing out of the ordinary. Daniel raised his hand, and the reflection did the same. But when he lowered his hand, the reflection held his still raised, frozen in a gesture that seemed to mock his attempt at control. "Who are you?" Daniel asked in a whisper, feeling foolish for talking to his own reflection. To his horror, the reflection responded, but not with words. Instead, it began to move slowly, gesturing in a different way than he did, as if communicating in a language Daniel didn't understand. Then the reflection stepped closer to the glass, pressing its face against the surface, its dark eyes fixed on his, as if trying to break through. Daniel instinctively recoiled, but his feet felt rooted to the spot. The reflection stepped back and raised a finger to its lips in a gesture of silence. Daniel felt a chill run down his spine. This was no longer just a reflection. It was something alive, something evil. In the days that followed, Daniel found his life changing. He began to lose time, forgetting what he had done for hours on end. Colleagues commented on conversations he didn't remember having, and appointments he didn't remember keeping. It was as if someone was living his life while he was absent. Inexplicable periods of time. One night, while reviewing his work emails, Daniel found an exchange of messages he didn't remember writing. They were detailed plans of actions he would never take. Meetings, suspicious transactions, and cold, calculating messages. Didn't sound like him. Daniel began to realize the extent of what was happening. His reflection was trying to take his place. Desperate, he went back to the mirror and confronted the figure on the other side. The reflection was waiting, now completely independent of his movements. It seemed more confident, more real than ever. Daniel struck the glass, but his hand hit the cold, solid surface. The reflection only laughed, a silent, echoless sound that Daniel could feel reverberating in his mind. "I am you, but better," the reflection finally spoke, without moving its lips. Words rang in Daniel's mind like an intrusive thought. "You are nothing without me. I am the version of you that you always wanted to be, free, fearless, morally unfeeling." Daniel began to lose control of his own life. He found himself trapped in a cycle of sleepless nights and confused days. Each time he looked in the mirror, the reflection seemed stronger, more alive. He began to notice physical changes too. Bruises he didn't remember having, clothes he didn't remember wearing. It was as if he were being erased, little by little. That night, Daniel decided to take action. He grabbed a hammer and headed to the bathroom, determined to destroy the mirror. The reflection stared back at him with a defiant look, as if it knew exactly what he was planning. Daniel raised the hammer, but as the glass shattered, he felt a sharp pain in his head, as if something was trying to pull him in. The shards of the mirror fell to the floor, but Daniel didn't feel free. Instead, he felt like a part of himself had been shattered along with the glass. The reflection hadn't disappeared. It was now inside Daniel, sharing his mind, his thoughts, controlling him in ways he couldn't help. With the mirror destroyed, Daniel hoped to regain control, but he realized the battle was far from over. His reflection had found a new home within him, shaping his actions and decisions. He was a prisoner in his own body, watching his life being lived by a stranger who shared his face. He stopped fighting. Each day, his consciousness faded a little more, giving way to that distorted version of himself. Friends and colleagues noticed the changes. Daniel had become colder, more distant, his actions calculated, and his smiles empty. He was no longer the ordinary man everyone knew. He was the reflection, the evil version that had finally won his freedom. Daniel had become the stranger in the mirror, trapped in an endless cycle of self-deception and darkness. And the reflection, now completely in control, lived the life he had always wanted, while the real Daniel disappeared forever, swallowed up by the stranger in the mirror.